Chapter 17, Late Renaissance and Mannerism in the 16th Century Italy, continued. The Council of Trent was in 1564. There were several reforms in this, one of which was that the believers should see the elevation of the host, or the bread, at Mass. This meant that a basilica hall-style church was the best, so we're going to see some modifications on church architecture. Also during this time, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, was founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits was promoted by Pope Paul III. The order was approved in 1540. The Jesuits tend to be intellectuals starting schools, colleges, as well as missionaries. First church of the Jesuits, Il Gesù, was started to be planned in 1550. The facade of Il Gesù was done by Giacomo della Porta. The interior of the space was designed by Michelangelo's student Giacomo Vignola. While the design started in 1568, the church was not completed until 1584. So because the Jesuits came out of this reform movement, we have a desire to avoid excess ornamentation. Because of the reforms in the Council of Trent, we were having a large hall-like space in the interior. We don't want a lot of visual obstructions. So on the exterior that we see here, we have a pediment here at the top, very classical Greco-Roman. We have these single-story pilasters. Remember, pilasters are those flat against the facade columns. We do have a very definite differentiation between the two stories. One interesting thing we do have is this wonderful scrolls. The last time we saw these scrolls were with Michelangelo's Laurentian Library. The other interesting thing about the facade is that the height is about equal to the width of this facade. So we don't have the height that we had with the Gothic. Palazzo del Te. This is in Mantua. This is part of the Gonzaga family. They were rulers of this area of Mantua. They had the title of Marquis. They are Francisco II, and Isabella d'Este is his wife. His son Federico becomes Marquis in 1519. Isabella is one of the most active art patrons in the 16th century. So this is the courtyard for his palace, Palazzo del Te. This is in Mantua. This is created by Francesco for his mistress, as well as an area to receive the king. This is created by Giulio Romano, who was Raphael's chief assistant. We have a lot of classical Greco-Roman architecture here, columns. We have triglyphs and metopes up here, if you remember from the Greek temples. But one thing you would never see that was against the kind of rules of the Greco-Roman style book, if you will, is this pediment over this arch. So we have a pediment over an arch. Giulio Romano is well known for his painting as well. This is from the interior of the Palazzo del Te in Mantua. This is a huge fresco he did, The Fall of the Giants from Mount Olympus. Antonio Allegri de Correggio, Jupiter and Io. This is also created for Duke Federico. This is coming from the story from Ovid, where Jupiter changed shapes to seduce various lovers. In this one, he appears as a cloud to the nymph Io to seduce her. We definitely have a lot of that smoky sfumato. So we see this cloud coming at Io, and in that cloud we have this human face of Jupiter, and we have this kind of paw-like hand coming around her. Very romantic, very much in the Greco-Roman mythological tradition. Correggio. This is the Assumption of the Virgin. So this is after the Virgin Mary has died. She immediately goes into heaven. She doesn't have to wait. So she immediately goes into heaven, including with her physical body. And that's what we see. We're actually looking up into the dome. So we can see some of these windows there in the drum of the dome. And so this is all painted. So you're looking up into this round space, and the artist, Correggio, is using that round space to create the idea that you are keeping looking up. And the very middle, very tip of it is, of course, this blinding light of heaven. And we have the body of Mary being brought into heaven. Girolamo Francesco Maria Mazzola Parmigianino. This is his self-portrait. This is actually using a convex mirror to create this so that the hand is much larger than the face. He's also painting this on a convex panel. This is to show his proficiency in creating the appropriate amount of distortion with this convex mirror. This is the Madonna with the long neck, also by Parmigianino. This was commissioned by a noblewoman of Parma for the Church of Santa Maria dei Servi. So we have this beautiful woman with this very oval face and swan-like neck. In fact, her neck is a little too long and the shoulders a little too small. So we have this kind of awkwardness. Also, she tends to be very pear-shaped, as the hip area is evidently much larger than her very tiny shoulders. You'll also notice that the Christ child is very large for a baby and seems to be sliding off of her lap because her lap doesn't seem to be very stable. She has one foot on the cushions and one toe holding up the other leg, and the baby seems to be falling with the arms flailing out, as it were. You'll notice that there's this column in the background. The column can represent a couple of things. One, it can be seen as a gateway to heaven, which is oftentimes what the Madonna is considered to be, that she is the one that listens to and is able to help humanity. Also, it could represent the column on which Jesus endured flagellation during the Passion. We also have this amphora over here. An amphora would have been used for various liquids, wine, olive oil. This comes from Greco-Roman times. And then we also have this tiny figure back down here. So on the bottom right corner, we have this tiny figure of Saint Jerome. So I don't want you to think that all Renaissance artists were men. They were not. There were many female artists. The problem was that they are not given the due credit that they deserve then or now. So we're going to talk about two of them. Lavinia Fontana is one. She was the daughter of a painter, Prospero Fontana, who was a very distinguished painter. He was the head of the Painters Guild, and she learned from her father how to paint. Most academies would not accept women during this time, so most women did have to learn how to paint from a father, an uncle, some relation. She's most well known for her religious paintings as well as her portraits. In fact, she does a lot of portraits of women. So this is a portrait of a noblewoman. We don't have her name anymore, but it's most likely a wedding portrait. This woman is obviously wearing her finest garments. We have embroidered garments, some silk. We have beautiful jewels. We have the flowers in her hair, and we have the tiny little dog. Now, the tiny little dog could be her dog, or it could represent loyalty. She does have her eyes averted from you, the viewer, symbol of modesty. She does have a fur pelt here, hanging from the chain. That could represent fertility. The other female artist we're going to talk about is Sophonisba Anguissola. This is her self-portrait. She was the daughter of a nobleman in Cremona in northern Italy. She actually received training in painting as a professional. She was tutor to Elizabeth of Valois, queen of Philip II of Spain, and became lady-in-waiting. Philip II of Spain hired her as the court artist, and she moved to Spain in 1559. Mostly, she did portraits of the imperial family. After the queen's death, King Philip II arranged for her to marry in 1571 to Fabrizio Moncada Pignatelli. They left Spain in 1578. He died in 1579. 2 years later, she fell in love with a sea merchant, Orazio Lamellini. She ended up living to be 93 years old. Now you might think, well, why did the king arrange for her to marry? Well, this was a way for her to be able to be on her own. Women needed, in this time, to have a means of support. They needed to have the support in the social circles of a man, typically. And this arrangement, this marriage, did leave her financially well off, that she could do whatever she wanted. So whenever this gentleman died, she was able to get married to this sea merchant and not have to worry about money or anything. So this was actually a very advantageous marriage that the king had provided for her. And he provided for her because he knew that his beloved wife had really appreciated Sophonisba, not only as an artist, but as a friend. Again, she had been a lady in waiting to the queen, and so she was very close to the royal couple. So this is a painting she did when she was only 24 years old. This is a miniature painting. This, as you can see, was mounted to be worn as a necklace. We have the bezel there. So we have this very small painting of herself, the self-portrait. You'll also notice that she's holding this giant crest. So let's look and see what's going on. In this medallion, we have a monogram. We're not exactly sure. It could be an anagram of her father's name. We're a little unsure about that. But around the medallion, you can see we have her name, Sophonisba Anguissola, and then we have some other words. And translated, this says, by her hand, done with the aid of a mirror. And by the aid of the mirror is next to where her hand is. So the idea is, yes, she is the one doing this. It is the sitter that is actually making this. And here is another one of her paintings. Beautiful detail work. Now we are off to Venice. Here we're going to talk about a couple of different buildings. We're going to talk about the Mint and the library. So the Mint is the building on the left. The library, the one on the right or center. And this is in the piazza between San Marco and the Canal of San Marco. We have the State Mint. You'll notice that the State Mint is a little more rough-hewn stone. It's a little more stable. It's a little more heavier architecture, as you would want something that housed the money to be. You want it to be more fortress-like, and it is. We really have the sense that this is a heavier building, especially when you compare it to the library on the right. Look how open and airy and light this building feels. And this makes sense. This is a public library. This is a repository of Greek and Latin manuscripts. This is something you want people to feel free to come in and feel comfortable. We have the Doric order of columns on the bottom and Ionic on the second story. Again, like the Colosseum, if you remember, we started with Doric and go up to Ionic. These are life-size statues there on the roof line. So these are life-size. Villa Rotunda by Andrea Palladio. We are going to see this style come back, so please pay special attention to this. This is going to be important in subsequent chapters. So Villa Rotunda, we basically have a square building. Each of the four sides have a temple front, and then we have it all capped by a dome. So square building, dome, temple front on all four sides. This is a country residence for the humanist cleric Paulo Almerico, and this building was actually based on the writings of Vitruvius and Pliny. So we've got the pediment and we have Ionic columns underneath. We have grand staircases coming up to each of the doors in each of the four sides. Again, we have life-size sculptures on the eaves. Venus of Urbino by Titian. So we have a nude woman. She seems very comfortable with herself. She's looking directly at you, the viewer. She has no shame. She's not really trying to hide, though she does have a hand purposely covering a little bit. Now this actually could be a wedding portrait because the women in the background seem to be getting some of her garments ready, and it could be that they're getting her ready for her wedding. Again, we have the cute little dog for representing faithfulness. This was actually commissioned by the Duke of Urbino. In the background, we actually have a myrtle tree. Myrtle represents eternal commitment. Again, another reason it could be for a wedding. We know that this is set at the Ducal Palace of Urbino because of the background. We know that the architecture, these big windows with the column in the center, and some of the furnishings, that this is just like the Ducal Palace in Urbino. This is another piece by Titian. This is Danae. Another one of Jupiter's guises coming to yet another young woman to seduce her. In this case, he is coming as a guise of a shower of golden coins, as you can see here. We also see that in this one, his style is a little more light and feathery. And this is the Rape of Europa. This was created for Philip II of Spain. This was a part of a series of works based on the loves of Jupiter. This was based on the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphosis. In this time, Jupiter takes the shape of a white bull to seduce a princess, and he's trying to evade his wife Juno. The bull ends up swimming away with Europa on his back. You notice that in this one we have that looser brushwork, so we still have the Jupiter in the various guises. We have kind of an impasto technique here. You'll notice that the background is very, very far away. So the idea is that they are successfully running away because you have the tiny little people here and the kind of the mountains in the background. Lest you think that all that Titian does are these romantic images of naked women, he actually does a lot of religious works as well. This is a Pietà he did for his own tomb. Ended up being finished by one of his students. We have Moses on this side, and we have one of the Sibyls, or prophetesses, on the right side. It's a very dark piece. Obviously dark subject matter as well. We have the Virgin Mary with the Christ. We do have the lovely halo, a little more distinct for Christ, but we do have a subtle halo on Mary as well. The gentleman here is Saint Jerome. The Feast in the House of Levi by Paolo Veronese. This was for the refectory of the Dominican monastery. Now remember, refectory is a dining hall. Just like the Last Supper that was done by Leonardo for a refectory of a monastery, this also was a Last Supper. We see Christ in the center. We see a subtle lightening of the area around him as a subtle halo. We have the apostles, but we have a lot of other people and we have a lot of other things happening. So what happened is Veronese completed this work, but we have something going on during this time called the Inquisition. So the Inquisition called Veronese in and said that this was too vulgar, that he painted, quote, buffoons, drunkards, Germans, dwarfs, and similar vulgarities. In which case, Veronese said, I'm so sorry. Did I say this was called the Last Supper? I really meant that it was the Feast in the House of Levi. The change of the name made the Inquisition happy, and so it is now Feast in the House of Levi, even though originally it was the Last Supper. Jacopo Robusti Tintoretto. the Last Supper. Robusti is actually his last name. Tintoretto was a nickname. Jacopo Robusti was born the son of a silk dyer, or a tintore. Because his father was a tintore, his nickname became Il Tintoretto, basically little silk dyer. He was a pupil of Titian's for only 10 days. Now, there's lots of stories surrounding this, but as much as researchers can tell that yes, he probably was a pupil of Titian's for a short amount of time. So why only a short amount of time? Well, it depends on who you ask. According to Tintoretto, it was because Titian sent him home because he was afraid of Tintoretto's talent. Obviously, Titian had a different story, but Tintoretto definitely had moxie. He hung an inscription over his studio that, translated, said, Michelangelo's design, Titian's color. So he obviously thought highly of his work. This Last Supper was for San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. So how is this Last Supper different from the other Last Suppers that we have seen? Well, for one, most of the Last Suppers we've seen, table has been straight across, and we've seen all of the apostles and we have seen Christ all lined up at this table. This one, we have a strong angle. We're not looking directly at the table. We're looking from this corner. In fact, we're looking high up in this corner. So we have a bird's eye view in the corner of the room, surveying the whole room, not just the table. Now, the angle of this would have been even more distinct because this would have been viewed from down below at the altar rail. So the monks would have come down and knelt at the altar rail and been looking up. So very important to notice the angle you should have been looking at these pieces at. So we have the striking angle, we have the angle from which we're viewing everything, and we're viewing everything. We see all of the people who are bringing the food, who are washing the dishes. We see all of the servants, all of the ancillary people surrounding Christ and his apostles. We have Christ standing and doing something. This is not the peaceful imagery that we saw in the Renaissance, where we had Christ peacefully in the center. This one, we have Christ up and doing. So he is up and he's standing. What's making this Mannerist is the angle of the table, the fact that Christ is standing and in motion, the fact that we're looking at it from this bird's eye view. These are all elements making this Mannerist versus a typical Renaissance piece. We actually have a lot of detail in the background. And then we have these wonderful images of angels that are swirling all around. They seem almost ghost-like, and they seem to almost be emanating from these oil lamps. But we do have these wonderful angels swirling all around. The building that this Last Supper is in is definitely of the time period. So we can see the wonderful lines of the ceiling and the floor, and it's definitely a contemporary setting. Where is Judas in this one? And Judas is on the other side of the table. So he is physically separated from everyone else. This is the Tintoretto piece that we have at the museum. You might have seen it. This is a portrait of Michele Soriano, who was the Venetian ambassador. So how do we know who these people are? Well, we actually can tell from a lot of the different symbols and signs that are in the painting. So we have this wonderful papal bull right here, and we can actually read a lot of it. And this is actually identifying who this is. This is identifying that this man is Michele Soriano and the ambassador to Pope Pius V on behalf of the Venetian Republic. His identity is also confirmed with the fact that in the window, notice we have a lot of these portraits. We have this window. In this window, we have the papal residence, Castel San Angelo, so confirming his position. He was a well-known Venetian ambassador who had served in Spain from 1558 to 1559 and in France from 1560 to 61. In 1564, he went on a mission to the Cardinal of Lorraine at the Council of Trent and to Maximilian II, who had been crowned King of the Romans. He helped broker the alliance which led to the defeat of the Turks in the Battle of Lepanto.